Welcome to a special Westminster edition of Sputnik, orbiting the world. With me, George Galloway. The reason is obvious. All bets are off, all plans scrapped. When Theresa May announced that at 11:15 she was going to make a statement outside number 10 Downing Street, I for one had no doubt. Well, I had a slight scintilla of doubt. It was either a general election or it was another war. And these days, who knows which of those two it would be. As some wag put it this morning, polling stations are sometimes used as primary schools. The country has been going back and back and back to the polls, particularly in the north of Ireland or in Scotland. There seems no end to the number of polls. But does more mean better? Are we going to get better governance in Britain now that the Fixed Term Parliament Act has been scrapped and we're going to the polls on June the 8th? Well, the first ball has been kicked. All the players and parties are in action. So who better to ruminate about it all with me than my old friend Steve Norris? Steve is a former Conservative government minister, twice stood for the Tories to be Mayor of London. He's a wise man and a fine one, and I'm glad he's joined me on the Sputnik.
Pleasure, George.
I've got to be blunt. I believe that this rushed election has more to do with internal problems for the Conservative Party than it does for the country. What would you say to that?
I think there's no doubt about it that Theresa May thinks that she's going to get at least two things out of this election. Firstly, she looks at Labour's weakness. You know, there are many people who say that there was one single word that summed up her very considerable change of heart, because until recently, as you know, she's been saying absolutely not.
Five times she said it.
5 times we're not going to have an election. Suddenly we're going to have an election. When the Labour Party is now, according to polls, 24 points behind the Conservatives, I think the logic, you know, becomes absolutely unassailable. And you know, as Keynes, John Maynard Keynes said, when the facts change, I change my opinions. But there's also true that she's concerned about the extent to which, with her current very slim majority, she can be boxed in by some of the ultra-right-wing levers in her party, that is, those who are very, very keen to see a complete break with the European Union, indeed almost a complete break with Europe, an absolute ban on migration for a number of years, which they see as somehow encouraging our economy, whereas some of us think it would be disastrous. And she will get out of this, what she's looking for out of this is the kind of majority which A, gives her a mandate of her own, something that she hasn't had until now, and B, gives her the room to be able to manage her own party. Now, when you're faced with those two opportunities and an opposition who really does seem to be incredibly weak right now, I think, frankly, the logic became unassailable.
Well, we'll come to the polls and Labour and Corbyn later. I just enter the caveat that there have been many polls that have turned out to be disastrously wrong. I sat over the river in the RT studios, the only man, it would appear, in Britain who believed that Brexit was going to win. And at one stage, the betting merchants were saying it was a 90% certainty that we were going to remain in the EU. I sat in this studio as they started the count in the United States, apparently the only man in Britain who thought that Donald Trump was going to win. So, of course, things can change, especially in a long election. But let me put to you something that only Channel 4 News has really been running with. It appears that the prosecuting authorities are poised to make recommendations which would involve the prosecution of Conservative election wallahs, including, it said, some MPs, for overspending, or rather under-recording their spending in the 2015 general election, opening up the possibility that there might have been a series of by-elections upon conviction, if convicted, which would have whittled away that very narrow majority. Do you think there's anything in that?
You and I know, and I mean you and I, amongst very few people, know just how ludicrous our rules are about how much you can spend in elections. But perhaps for those who aren't familiar, it's worth just saying that individual candidates have very, very tight spending limits, which they must not exceed. If you're seen to have exceeded that very tight spending limit by even a few pounds, you can be in jail. And it's happened before, and it could have happened in any of these cases. I don't know the details, and I wouldn't want to speculate.
No, neither do I.
But nonetheless, prima facie, there was a case to be made. But the irony is that in this country, the national parties are able to spend whatever they like. There is no limit whatever on their spending budgets, and they spend 20 million, 30 million on general elections. This is getting more and more like the United States in those terms.
Yeah.
And what
But we as individuals can spend only 13,000.
We as individuals,
£420, 40
whatever,
pence.
40p, and if you spend 50p, you're in trouble. You know, so I think a lot of this was about, in practice, it was about, for example, the national party leader or big beasts of the particular party roll into town, into a particular constituency, do a lot of campaigning for the day, and then leave. And the question really was, does that mean that the local MP had to account for that money, that cost, if you like, as part of his or her budget, or was that part of the national budget? And of course, the argument, the defense, if you like, would have been, don't be ridiculous. Of course, because the law is so opaque, George.
If there aren't any cases, they should send for you, because you've made a very strong defence, and one which I agree with. But nonetheless, the law is the law.
Yeah.
And if prosecutions had ensued,
yeah,
and we'll know in a day or two whether they will, that would have been a severe problem for the government.
It would have been a problem, but I'm not sure I follow your logic when you say that that would have whittled a majority, because that's on the assumption that a new candidate from the same party wouldn't have simply won the seat, when actually all of the background noise would have been, whatever the courts have decided, you and I know this is a stitch-up, and actually I suspect the vast majority of those candidates would have seen their successors re-elected.
Well, look, if that law was an ass, and I think we're in agreement that it was, what about the Fixed Term Parliament Act? We're supposed to be locked into a 5-year parliament. That didn't last long.
Well, you and I know that when I was Parliamentary Private Secretary in the Home Office, the then Home Secretary introduced a piece of legislation called the Dangerous Dogs Act. Now, I'm not going to tell viewers a lot about the Dangerous Dogs Act, but basically I've decided that trying to legislate to tell a dog what to do is a pretty pointless proposition. It's been known as one of the daftest acts the Tory government ever introduced. And alongside that, I think, goes the Fixed Term Parliament Act. I used to say to people, forget all this business of a 2/3 majority. A simple majority could simply abolish the act. And had Theresa May, for whatever reason, found that it was necessary to invoke that proposition, should have easily done so. You can sweep any act off the statute book by a simple majority in the House of Commons, by one vote if necessary. No, it was pointless. It was a sop to Nick Clegg during the days of the coalition, and it's rightly been consigned to history. We don't operate that system, because if a Prime Minister, as you well know, if a Prime Minister loses the confidence of the House of Commons, he or she is bound to resign, and is bound on that basis of losing a vote of confidence to go to the country and to dissolve Parliament.
Now, we found a rare measure of agreement so far. Let me throw one in that we might not agree on. I think Theresa May's announcement that she would not face the others in televised debates might be a leitmotif running through this election. Frit, scared, cowardly even, and certainly not democratic, hiding away from the electorate, hoping that the tide which she imagines to be there will sweep her in. That may turn out to be a very considerable mistake.
It may, actually. It may, because you're right about that sort of leitmotif, which obviously all the opposition parties will try to underpin. It's worth reflecting, though, that, Tony Blair, for example, never indulged in a TV debate. And the reason he didn't was he said, I'm way in the lead. I can only lose. And, of course, it was Gordon Brown, ironically, who first agreed.
A man least qualified to do so.
Well, your words, not mine, George, but I'm not far away from you. Yeah. And then, of course, David Cameron, who was in and not in, was going to do it, then not going to do it, then tried to dictate terms, then got dictated to, and it was all a bit of a dog's breakfast. It's pretty typical of Theresa to say, look, I am far away in the lead. I have nothing to gain and everything to lose by indulging in this piece of television which is nothing to do with the real issues in front of the country, I'm not going to do it. Unfortunately, I agree with you that that gives the opportunity to the opposition, to all the opposition parties, to play this frit card, if you like. And where will that end up? You know, in all honesty, I don't know. This could end up defining any future election as one in which you simply have to participate,
well, especially
whether you like it or
if,
not.
I take your point that these are new things, televised
relatively
debates,
new in the UK.
Although in an age where a day is a long time in politics, people think it's always been the case that contenders for power appear against each other in front of the cameras. But what if the TV companies have the, if I may put it that way, to go ahead with the debates and empty chair the Prime Minister, the leader of the Conservative Party, or do a Roy Hattersley and put some kind of icon there instead? That's going to be a big problem for the Tories.
Well, it could be, but then again, don't forget that she'll have an opportunity to put her side of the case as well. She'll say, this is irrelevant, this is only done for television, it adds nothing. I will be speaking that night in front of an audience, and if a camera would like to come and record what I say, that is my pitch to the British people. I'm not here to pander to some TV channel. I am talking direct to the British people, you know. Is that convincing enough? I don't know, I'm genuinely not sure. I would have said to her, do it for goodness sake. And what's more, do it the way they like, because you're going to win anyway.
It's not exactly as if our adversaries are wonderful orators, wonderful debaters. We're talking Jeremy Corbyn, Tim Ferran. I suppose maybe the Nationalists would squeeze in for one or two, although that might be problematic. I myself think it's quite a significant mistake, and one that will haunt her through the campaign. We've got to take a break now, but we're all lucky that you can stay for the second half. And let's tour the opposition horizon. This is a special Westminster edition of Sputnik, orbiting the world, with me, George Galloway. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sputnik, orbiting the world, with me, George Galloway, a special Westminster edition in the wake of the Prime Minister's surprising call for a general election on June the 8th. I'm joined by a Tory grandee who's never had the garlands that he deserves, but a former minister, former Tory mayoral candidate here in London, and an all-round wise guy and good one. Steve, Theresa May is up against, as you pointed out, an opposition at the lowest levels, predicted to get the lowest parliamentary representation since 1935. But just like Trump, there is a possibility that Jeremy Corbyn might, as it were, set the country alight with expectation, with possibility. There's a lot of anti-Tory feeling, particularly in poor places, post-industrial places, parts of the kingdom which are far from her home county's kind of appeal. Do you discount that possibility entirely?
No, you know, you talked about how you were the only person who thought that we'd leave the EU and the only person who thought we'd elect Donald Trump. I won a lot of money on the EU referendum. Unfortunately, I lost the lot on Trump, so don't ask me. However, I do remember John Howard. John Howard, the Australian Premier, who found himself in a position where he was way ahead in the opinion polls. His party just won a surprisingly good by-election. He decided to go to the country, and 5 weeks later was ousted by a Labour administration, which actually won 75 out of 125 seats in their lower house. I mean, in other words, these surprises can happen. So do I discount it completely? No. And I think it would be foolish for anybody ever to do so. Jeremy Corbyn has surprised many, many people already. When he was finally included in the lineup for the Labour leadership alongside such titans as Andy, you know, never known to claw defeat from the jaws of victory, Burnham, or Yvette Cooper or whatever, he surprised everybody, I suspect, by winning and winning by a big margin. 200 to 1 and won by a clear margin. So do I discount it? No, I don't. However, I think what's interesting is the way that dynamics have changed. Theresa May has won a grudging respect, even from people who are not natural Tories. And it's to do, I think, with her personal character. She's pretty tough. She is not given to sound bites. She is thought of as somebody who tells it as it is. She's even able, I suspect, to persuade people that even though she said, I'm not going to have an election, I'm not going to have an election, I'm not, you know, and so on, many times over, and then says, I am, she's able to persuade people that somehow this is consistent with the line that she's taking. And that's quite a trick. I think the last person we saw with that kind of ability was of course, Tony Blair, and prior to that, Margaret Thatcher. Neither John Major, nor Gordon Brown, nor David Cameron had that ability. And so I suspect this will be more than ever about personalities, about who do you want to lead us in this uncertain time when we are facing a Brexit negotiation, which is either going to go very well or very badly. And it's worth, therefore, I think, more reflecting on the time when, for example, Michael Foot led the Labour Party, and you will remember this very, very well indeed. And again, it became a choice between Thatcher, who had just apparently personally won the Falklands War, and Michael Foot, who was seen as completely out of touch and, you know, far too old.
From another world.
And from another world.
But I'll tell you something about Corbyn. And I think you know this, he's a good and honest person. Yeah. He's sincere. He has principles. And the one thing he's good at, he's not that great in the House of Commons, though he's got better. The one thing he's good at is out there on the street. And that's where his election will be fought. It is possible that he can capture the zeitgeist, capture the imagination against a rather straight-laced Tory leadership and Tory campaign.
I can't disagree with that, George. I think that's right. I mean, I mean, I've known him for the 30-odd years, not as long as you, but I've certainly known him as a fellow member of the House of Commons. He is clearly a man of integrity. He's a man who sticks by his principles. He's a man who tells it the way he sees it and not the way he's told to see it. I get all that. And I also get the fact that he's good on the stump. I mean, I saw him out in Croydon, which is a swing seat yesterday, and he was full of fire and vigour, and I think he'll go on doing that during the election campaign. He's no Michael Foot in that context. No. It's also true that Mrs May is not a great natural orator, not by any means. She's more comfortable reading a speech than she is extemporising, and I always think that, I mean, you can do this, and I like to think I used to be able to do it, you know. To extemporise is to have been seen to be speaking from the heart. Yeah. So can this have a big impact? Yes, it could. I think the problem that Jeremy Corbyn has, however, is that his opposition is mainly from his own party. His back is full of holes. His back is full of holes. This is a man who has MPs in his own party saying, we're going to stand as a Labour candidate, but we would never vote for him as a Prime Minister.
Yes, it's quite unprecedented.
That's unprecedented.
Now, the Liberals, on the face of it, were dead and buried in 2015. Brexit has undoubtedly given them some more wind in their sails, how much we shall see. But they're running unequivocally as the second referendum people. That's right. Try to scupper Brexit, and if we can't scupper it, make it as moderate a break as possible. 48% of the people voted to remain in the EU, so that's a potential vote bank of some importance if people all got behind the Liberals. What do you think of that?
Well, I remember Zach Goldsmith, who, for completely separate reasons, resigned and put himself up for re-election. That was over the issue of building a third runway at Heathrow. But nonetheless, it was immediately after a time when he had voted to leave. His father, of course, famously founded the Referendum Party, and so his views are very clear. But his constituents were overwhelmingly for Remain. And they ditched him. And that was because the Lib Dems were able to say, well, we, of course, are Remainers, and we will stick up for you, and we represent you. And who's to say what impact that will have? I have a sneaking suspicion that there will be a few Liberal wins against Tories in seats that they've previously held, and it will be on that basis. However, again, you know, I really do sense that time has moved on. Every poll tells us that many people who did vote Remain are now resigned to
sure.
the democratic vote.
That's my own experience too.
And then they're saying, okay, so who's going to be best to negotiate the best deal for us? And it's not Tim Farron, you know. In the end, you and I know, it's the one thing that unites all Tories and all Labour politicians, is that the Lib Dems are the most cynical party in British politics.
Yes, everyone hates them.
We all hate the Liberal Democrats. It's a famous sport in this country, but it has some merit as well.
I predict here that they'll go from 8 to certainly double figures, maybe 30 or so.
Maybe 20,
MPs.
maybe 30.
They'll do quite well.
Mrs May, of course, banks on the idea that she will more than make up the difference in areas where we, as a party, the Conservatives, haven't necessarily been prominent for a generation. It was significant to me that she appeared yesterday in Bolton, in what is now a Labour seat, but was a Tory seat back in the 90s, and she sees us able to win that kind of a seat. Now, that's quite a pitch. Of course, Jeremy Corbyn was in Croydon, a seat that is now held by a Tory, but is pretty marginal. He, too, is looking to be able to shift that one. But I think her view is that, yes, there'll be a bit of collateral damage from the Lib Dems, but it'll be more than overtaken by the seats that she wins in places where the sense is among Labour voters that we've always been Labour, but we can't vote for Jeremy Corbyn as a leader. Now, this decent, honourable man that you and I have just discussed faces that huge, huge problem of credibility as a leader.
Well, we'll see. What about UKIP, who are between... well, I don't know if they're between leaders. I think Nuttall is still the leader. Nigel Farage is clearly the leader, but he's over the water, and we don't know if he's going to run again. Are UKIP done and dusted, do you think? Is there a historic achievement to have got the referendum, to have seen it go their way, and that many people think there's not really that much further point for them?
I think Mrs May has shot their fox. Although she was a Remainer, technically, if what maybe somewhat reluctantly, after the vote, and when she was elected as, or appointed almost as leader of the Tory party, she made that famous, wonderfully Delphic comment, Brexit means Brexit. We could have a whole programme discussing what that means. But nonetheless, it's there, you know. What it did say was, I'm not going to overturn this, we are going to leave, and I am going to get the best deal that I can for the UK. And everything that she said after that is really simply making UKIP's position, frankly, now irrelevant. They'll, of course, say, well, we've got to hold our feet to the fire and so on. But A, the present leader, Paul Nuttall, is frankly incredible. And I mean that in the sense that so far we can't believe a word he says. And B, that Nigel Farage may or may not decide to stand in Thanet South, a seat that he's fought and lost in before. Whether he does or not, he's not going to be as prominent or, frankly, have the same case to make as he was able to make in 2015. So UKIP, for me, not surprising that the increased lead that the Tories got in recent polls all came not at the expense of Labour, but actually at the expense of UKIP.
Finally, then, many people thought initially, not I, but many thought that Mrs May is going for a bigger majority to drive through a hard Brexit. I think the opposite. I think she wants to have a mandate and have enough hinterland around her that she can make the deal, and her instincts as a Remainer, in fact, are likely to see Britain negotiate more of a sweetheart deal with the EU rather than the break that the Brexiteers perhaps imagined.
I couldn't agree more. In simple terms, I couldn't agree more. You know, speaking as somebody who voted to leave, I believe that we should take back control of our borders and our laws. I believe that we should be acting in the interest of the British people unequivocally. I dislike unelected bureaucracies being able to dictate to a country that still calls itself a country. But, for example, taking back control of our borders is not going to mean closing them unless we really do want to commit economic suicide. We need migrants. This country will need migrants for the foreseeable future to deal with the expansion in our economy. We're still the fastest growing economy in the G7. Now, you know, Mrs May, precisely as you say, is not going to get re-elected in order to push some kind of let's split each other's lip kind of, conclusion with the EU. On the contrary, it's precisely to say, you don't want tariffs, neither do we. We want to take back control of our borders and our laws, but A, we're going to keep 90% of the laws, and B, we're certainly not going to close the borders. Why would we do it? It would be insane. And it's that ultra-leaver part of the Tory party in Parliament that she wants to diminish the influence of by getting a much bigger majority in her own name.
Steve Norris, it's been fantastic, fascinating talking to you. Steve Norris, Tory grandee, touring the horizon with me as we get the 2017 British general election underway. I hope you've enjoyed the show. It's been marvellous.